Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you about the IPCC synthesis report that was just released in March of this year. I'm looking at this from the perspective of IPCC Working Group 2, where we are looking at climate risks and how to deal with them, considering the vulnerability of people and nature, as well as the impacts of climate change that have already been observed. During this cycle, in the sixth assessment cycle, we have released several reports that have made it into the IPCC synthesis report. First of all, these are the main working group reports by Working Group 1, 2, and 3, as well as important special reports, starting with the special report on global warming of 1.5, followed by the special report on climate change and land, as well as the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. Summarizing the important findings of these reports, here you see the different warming trends that are being projected for the future world, depending on the emission scenarios that humankind intends to follow. If we compare the different degrees of warming, and you see those displayed in the different globes at the bottom of this figure, you see how the warming trend plays out most strongly in the polar areas, the Arctic and the Antarctic, but then also most importantly over land. The warming over land is much more than the warming over the ocean, and the global mean temperature change should not mislead us in considering this fact and also the associated impacts. And we will look into this a little later. There's another important trend that is behind many of the impacts on ecosystems as well as on food production for human society, and that is the change in precipitation, and also concerned in relation to that and the temperature change, the change in soil moisture, which indicates water availability to the vegetation. The brownish colors tell you here that there are several areas on the planet that are more severely affected by unfavorable changes in soil moisture, losses of water availability. This concerns the Americas, it concerns the Mediterranean, and it also concerns part of Africa and also East Asia. Impacts are not only driven by temperature or changes in soil moisture, but they are driven by changes in multiple physical climate conditions, which are increasingly attributed to human influence. This concerns increase in drought, as already indicated, increase in fire weather, increase in compound flooding, in precipitation and associated flooding, increase in glacier retreat, and also the loss of global ice leads to an increase in global sea level. And virtually certain are the impacts of climate change on upper ocean acidification, as well as the increase in hot extremes. And all of these changes feed back on the living systems of the planet, ecosystems, and certainly also associated with that, human society. Accordingly, already with the current trend of warming between 1.5 and 1.2 degrees Celsius, we are already seeing widespread and substantial impacts and related losses and damages that can be attributed to climate change. This concerns physical water availability, agriculture, crop production, animal, livestock, health and productivity, fisheries yields and aquaculture production, and also with respect to human health and well-being, infectious diseases, heat and malnutrition and harm from wildfire, mental health problems, and displacements of human beings because they are losing habitat. Impacts are also observed with respect to cities, settlements, and infrastructure, as well as on biodiversity and ecosystems. In conclusion, there's no sector and system that remains untouched by climate change. And this prominent figure here summarizes actually how we as human beings are being affected by what is going on. The extent to which current and future generations will experience a hotter climate depends on choices now and in the near term. And you see in the center the degrees of warming that we've already seen, and with the increase in red and purple color, you see different scenarios unfolding from our current time. This means what we do now defines the future of humankind and planet. And at the bottom, you see how people with different ages are actually living into this future. And those born today or in 2020 will very likely see the end of the century and experience the decisions, the consequences of the decisions that we are making now. Now, what do we project in terms of impacts for the future? The different degrees of warming that are expected depending on the scenarios followed, which range between 1.5 and 4 degrees on average, will actually cause habitat losses for different species. And the brownish color to purple color that you see unfolding here on these globes is indicating actually the spatial expansion of unfavorable conditions for those mostly animal species to survive. And the impacts are especially strong in the lower latitudes. They concern land and they concern also the ocean, where with this habitat loss, we will see a decline in biodiversity. Animal life, as an overarching conclusion, has already started to retreat from the tropics, and this loss of habitat will be exacerbating depending on the degree of global warming. But it's not only concerning animals, and we are part of the animal kingdom, our species is. 3.3 to 3.6 billion people are displaying high vulnerability to climate change. This concerns people mostly living in large parts of Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, on the small islands, and in the Arctic. And there is a combination of factors that is especially challenging, and these are extremely high temperatures as well as high humidity. And if these conditions surpass a certain threshold, like 35 degrees at 100% humidity being the ultimate lethal limit, then the number of days with these conditions will increase in the future, is already high in various places, as you see on the small globe on the left-hand side. And the number of days will be increasing with those conditions, as indicated in the tropics, in the lower latitudes, mainly, where high humidity combines with high temperature extremes. The conclusion is that similar to what we have projected for the animal kingdom, the human species is losing habitat under climate change, and habitat is lost from the lower latitudes. Plant life is also affected by climate change, and plant sensitivity is actually not too far off with respect to and compared to what is observed with animals. And this also concerns specific crop species, like shown here for maize, where you see an increase in the purple area with increasing degrees of global warming, where areas where these crops are being planted currently are also lost and no longer available for productive agriculture of this species. And food production is also impacted in the ocean, where fisheries yields are declining, as again indicated by the purple color, strengthening in the comparison of these two globes. At the same time, we see some increase in fisheries results, and you can relate that to the earlier graphics that I was talking about, that animal species are actually being displaced and are moving to higher latitudes, and this also concerns fisheries stocks. So especially the developing countries in the low latitudes where you have small-scale artisanal fisheries are negatively impacted by the degree of climate change, leading us to the overall conclusion that food security is at stake. Now, we are quantifying these challenges, these risks in relation to the degree of climate change following the scenarios that have been developed, projected into the future, how global mean temperature will be developing. According to the global surface temperature change relative to pre-industrial periods, we see the degree of risks developing over time in this graphic. The risk levels are characterized by color code in the so-called burning amber diagrams, from white, undetectable, to yellow, moderate, to red, high, and to purple, very high. And on the right-hand side in this figure, you see a comparison of actually the risk levels as they have been compiled in the fifth assessment report up to 2014, and in comparison to the risk levels as assessed in the present assessment report towards this year, 2022-2023. And you see that the thresholds between yellow and red are actually moving down with respect to the degree of global warming. And these are overarching risk categories like unique and threatened systems include unique ecosystems like the warm water coral reefs, or we have extreme weather events and their impacts considered, distribution of impacts, global aggregate impacts, and large-scale singular events. For all of these, we must say that impacts have become more visible and stronger than anticipated, and this trend is projected to continue into the future. Certainly, a strong warming to humankind, leading to the conclusion to limit warming close to 1.5 degrees. Humans and nature are exposed to diverse risks, and here we have specified those risks a bit more for land-based systems in comparison to ocean or coastal ecosystems. So on the left-hand side, the land-based systems concern wildfire damage, permafrost degradation, biodiversity loss, dryland water scarcity, tree mortality, and carbon loss. And for the ocean, this concerns warm water corals, kelp forest, seagrass meadows, epipelagic systems, rocky shores, and salt marshes. And what you also see here is a red line indicating the 1.5 degrees global warming. And if you look at the processes on land that have been looked at, then you see that the 1.5 degree global warming actually nicely characterizes the transition from yellow to red, from moderate to high risk levels. Whereas for the ocean, for several systems, there seems to be a little bit of a safety margin with respect to the degrees of global warming, except for one system, and these are the warm water corals, where already at 1.5 degrees Celsius, there's a projection that these systems will decline in terms of their coverage by 70 to 90%, and with further global warming by 2 degrees, actually this may reach 99%. So this is a highly vulnerable system that is also already past its tipping point, and that we are on the verge of losing at large scale. And with that, we are also losing its services like fisheries provision for the developing countries or coastal protection to the increasing storm surges that are projected to happen depending on the degree of global warming. Now, this comparison of land-based system and ocean and coastal ecosystems at the same time may reflect the difference in the degree of warming over land compared to the ocean, where actually temperatures over land are reflecting already more or less the temperature changes beyond 1.5, whereas for ocean and coastal systems, we haven't yet reached that degree of warming. This resembles what I've indicated in one of the earlier slides. And again, the conclusion certainly is that with respect to the challenges ahead and projected, limiting warming close to 1.5 would be a wise move. This also concerns another process that is important for humankind with respect to maintaining human habitat and current infrastructure, and this is sea level rise, where you see the projections for sea level rise on the left-hand side, how they changes, how sea level changes in relation to the degree of global warming, and again, the risk assessment on the right-hand side with the 1.5 degree temperature line, which in actual fact is now also crossing different risk bars for different places, where you see on the left-hand side the ones which are more vulnerable, like urban atoll islands or Arctic communities, where even with intensive adaptation efforts, and this is indicated by the risk columns marked with a large R on the right-hand side of the pairings. And here you see that actually these risk transitions by adaptation efforts can move a little bit up, as we've seen in one of the earlier slides, but the efforts are sort of in vain in those smaller places depending on the degree of sea level rise, whereas resource-rich coastal cities have a larger scope and possibility to reduce the risk by adaptation, as indicated here. The conclusion must again be that it's a wise move to limit warming close to 1.5 degrees, to minimize the losses associated with sea level rise and to protect especially the low-lying coastal regions as well as the small island developing states. Now, how can this be achieved? This limiting warming exercise to 1.5 and possibly 2 degrees should involve rapid, deep, and in most cases, immediate greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And the blue and greenish lines on the left indicate how actually these emissions reduction should proceed. But I would like to refer to what our colleagues from Working Group 3 have to say about this. Just to add that the reddish lines, the implemented policies, do not lead us into a sustainable future because they would take us into a global warming world at 3 to 3.2 degrees Celsius. Adaptation needs to complement mitigation efforts. And our adaptation measures and the way how our societies evolve and develop is actually co-defining climate risks. And we see that here for two trends: heat-related morbidity and mortality, and food insecurity. And the SSP3 columns with limited adaptation and strong socioeconomic development would actually take us into a higher risk at even lower warming levels. Whereas when we move into a world with low population growth, high income, reduced inequalities, food produced in low greenhouse gas emission systems, effective land use regulation, and high adaptive capacity, then we can actually keep our risk levels at moderate level, both for health challenges like heat-related morbidity and mortality, as well as for food provision to humankind. And there's one overarching statement that needs to be said here. Limiting warming close to 1.5 degrees is a precondition to maintain high adaptation capacity and to support the result and the success of these efforts. This we have summarized into something that we call climate resilient development. And this is indicating a pathway which is indicated by a greenish color on this figure that we will see enlarged on the next slide, that would take us into a future with low emissions, where system transitions across all sectors of society and including ecosystem protection is successful, where we have transformative changes and take us into a future of low climate risk with equity and justice in place and achievement of sustainable development goals. But there is a rapidly narrowing time window of opportunity to enable higher climate resilient development. And here you see this slide somewhat enlarged. And again, the greenish slide where warming is limited to below 1.5 degrees even would be the best possible and provide the best possible prospects for a sustainable and climate resilient future. Whereas along those decision points that we are seeing here indicated and in relation to the shocks that may happening over time to society due to extreme events and so forth, this may actually take us into an unsustainable future, starting from our present situation as shown on the left. As a precondition, all aspects of life would change when avoiding greenhouse gas emissions and minimizing climate risks by adaptation. So each decision counts. And this is again emphasizing and summarizing our conclusion that limiting warming close to 1.5 is needed, partly because this is a precondition to maintain adaptation capacity. There are conditions that enable these individual and collective actions like inclusive governance, diverse knowledges and values, finance and innovation, integration across sectors and timescales. Ecosystem stewardship is important, synergies between climate and development actions, and behavioral change supported by policy, infrastructure, and social-cultural factors. But there are also barriers, there are conditions that constrain individual and collective actions, and sometimes individual not yet understanding the full scale of the challenges are behind those barriers. But there are also social barriers, poverty, inequity, and injustice, economic, institutional, social, and capacity barriers, siloed thinking and responses, lack of finance and barriers to finance and technology, and trade-offs with sustainable development goals. In conclusion, societal and political will is required to accelerate climate action. Now, there is a whole toolbox of measures that can be implemented to facilitate the transition into a sustainable future. And our assessments have assessed the options as well as their feasibility, as well as their success. And if I focus on the adaptation side, because that is the mandate of working group 2, you see that water management, land management, and the establishment of green infrastructure and maintaining ecosystem services are important issues. Enhanced health services will secure human well-being. And how these issues are being handled by society is important. We need risk sharing, social safety nets, climate services, disaster risk management, as well as other issues, sort of as a last resort, human migration, planned relocation, and resettlement and livelihood diversification. This is a selection, and this can be paired with different mitigation options that are also distinguished according to their cost and their feasibility. And adaptation measures often have synergies with mitigation. Now, where is this taking us? From our current imbalance, where we see climate change going on, where we see the impacts from climate change on human society, on ecosystems. And all of these negative things are caused by human society. We have also the possibilities to strengthen a positive link between systems, between human society, ecosystems, including biodiversity, as well as the climate system. And these positive interactions are outlined here in the fine lines, which we could strengthen as we go into a sustainable future, where human society adapts to and mitigates climate change, and a stabilizing climate system is supported by healthy ecosystems that have also adapted to the new climate, which, however, has not gone beyond 1.5 degrees global warming. Human systems, societies would make an effort to conserve and restore ecosystems, and would also strengthen ecosystem-based approaches. And as a positive return, ecosystems would support and provide livelihoods and stabilize the provision of their ecosystem services. We talk about climate resilient development in this context, supporting human health and well-being, equity and justice, and also having an interdependence, considering the interdependence between human health and ecosystem health, as well as planetary health. And these issues need to be established urgently, and in the future more timely than during the recent history, by governance measures, finance, knowledge and capacity, catalyzing conditions and technologies. And this is illustrating a system and how our landscapes may actually evolve into the future, where we implement a mosaic landscape of land, ocean, and freshwater scapes, where protected areas with high biodiversity that are supporting climate mitigation and adaptation are neighbored with more intensively used spaces, where still biodiversity is maintained and where human health is improved by having green and blue spaces, for example, in city arenas. And a similar approach concerns the ocean, where we distinguish protected areas from those that are sustainably and sometimes intensively used by humankind. The science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing time window to secure a livable future for all. IPCC AR6 reports offer solutions to the world. However, it is getting late to implement them and to be successful in reaching sustainability. Thank you very much for your attention.